Somewhere in the mountains of the American Southeast, there is a forest that remembers things the rest of the world forgot a long time ago. It remembers a time before the sun had a path across the sky. It remembers when animals could talk, when the earth was soft mud hanging from the sky on four cords, and when a stranger with a notebook sat by a fire and asked an old man to tell him the truth about how the world began. That old man almost said no. What he said instead changed what we know about one of the oldest living cultures in North America. And by the end of this story, you will understand why the Cherokee elders who finally decided to speak were taking one of the biggest risks of their lives. Picture the year 1887. The place is the Qualla boundary, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains of western North Carolina, a rugged, fog-wrapped stretch of ridges and hollows where the eastern band of the Cherokee had held on, hidden in plain sight, while thousands of their relatives had been forced west decades earlier on a road of suffering we now call the Trail of Tears. A young ethnologist named James Mooney arrives on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology. He is not Cherokee, he is an outsider, a government man, carrying paper and pencil into a community that has every reason in the world not to trust a government man. And yet, over the following years, something remarkable happens. The people open a door that had been closed for generations, and what comes through that door is a body of sacred stories, some of them thousands of years old in their bones, describing a forest world so alive, so layered with meaning, that once you hear it, you will never look at a stand of old trees the same way again. This is the story of what the Cherokee told James Mooney about the old forest. Settle in. It is a long road, and it winds through fire, thunder, giant snakes with crystals in their heads, corn that bleeds like a living thing, a boy born from a drop of blood, and a race of small people who still, some say, live in the rock shelters of the Smokies today. Let's walk into the trees together. Before we go further into the myths themselves, you should understand who was doing the telling, because the story of the storytelling is almost as remarkable as the stories. By the 1880s, the Cherokee Nation had already survived one of the most devastating chapters in American history. In 1838 and 1839, the United States government forced most of the Cherokee people from their homelands in the southern Appalachians and marched them over 1,000 miles west to what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way, from cold, from hunger, from disease, from grief so heavy it stopped hearts. It became known as the Trail of Tears. But not every Cherokee family made that walk. A number of communities, through a mix of legal maneuvering, hiding in the deep mountains, and sheer refusal to leave, managed to remain in the ancestral homeland. Their descendants became the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and it was among them, in those steep, mist-covered valleys of North Carolina, that James Mooney did his fieldwork. Mooney was young, intense, and by most accounts deeply respectful of the people he studied, at a time when that was far from guaranteed among white scholars. He didn't simply show up and demand stories. He spent years building relationships. He learned fragments of the Cherokee language. He earned the trust slowly of a handful of key figures, medicine men and tradition keepers who held knowledge that had never been written down, knowledge that in many cases was never meant to leave the community at all. One of those figures was a man named Iasta. Another was a healer and ceremonial leader known as Swimmer, or in Cherokee, Unini. Swimmer became Mooney's single most important source. He was, by the time Mooney met him, an old man who had spent his life memorizing sacred formulas, medicine songs, and origin stories passed down through a chain of memory, stretching back further than anyone could count. Swimmer kept some of this knowledge written in a private notebook using a script invented by a Cherokee genius named Sequoia, a system of 85 symbols that let the Cherokee language be written down for the first time in history. That notebook, filled with sacred formulas in Sequoia's syllabary, became one of the treasures Mooney was allowed to study, and with permission, translate. Understand what this means. These were not stories told casually around a campfire for entertainment, though some certainly could be enjoyed that way. Many of them were sacred knowledge, tied to healing practices, to relationships with plants and animals, to the proper way for a human being to exist inside a living, watching world. Sharing them with an outsider was an act of tremendous trust, and in some cases an act of quiet defiance against a country that had spent the better part of a century trying to erase Cherokee culture altogether. When Swimmer and the other elders spoke to Mooney, they were making a bet. They were betting that if their world was going to keep changing, if the old ways were going to keep eroding under the pressure of American expansion, then it was better to have the stories written down and remembered than to let them vanish into silence forever. That bet paid off. In 1900, Mooney published a massive study called Myths of the Cherokee, and it remains, over a century later, one of the single richest written records of a Native American oral tradition, compiled directly from tribal knowledge keepers rather than filtered through second-hand retellings. It is the foundation for almost everything we are about to explore together. Now let's step into the forest itself, because that is where these stories truly live. To understand the Cherokee Old Forest, you have to let go of the idea of a forest as simple scenery, a backdrop of trees standing quietly while the real story happens somewhere else. In the World Swimmer described to Mooney, the forest was never just scenery. It was a society. It had its own government, its own council fires, its own laws, its own grudges, and its own mercy. The animals held meetings. The plants listened in. The trees had memory. And the humans who walked beneath the canopy were not the main characters of the story. They were guests, sometimes welcome, sometimes not, moving through a world that had been arranged long before they arrived and would continue long after they were gone. The Cherokee word for the earth itself carries the flavor of this idea, a great island resting on water, hanging from the sky by 4 cords, one at each of the 4 directions. And according to what Swimmer told Mooney, that island did not start out the way it looks today. In the beginning, there was only water. All the animals lived above it, crowded onto a rock arch that stretched across the sky, called Gallenlati, and it was already too crowded up there, too tight, too loud, everyone bumping shoulders and wings and fins. They needed somewhere else to live. Picture it, above the water in a sky so packed with creatures that a beetle could barely turn around. The animals argue and murmur, and wonder what lies beneath the endless grey water below them. Someone has to go find out. Someone has to be brave enough, or foolish enough, to leave the safety of the rock arch and see what's really down there. The water beetle volunteers. In Cherokee, they call this creature Dayunisi, the beetle that offers to explore. It dives from the sky, down through empty space and hits the water, and it cannot find any bottom to stand on. So it does the only thing it can. It dives beneath the surface, all the way down into the dark, until finally it reaches soft mud far below. It scoops up a bit of that mud and brings it back up to the surface, and there, floating on the water, the mud begins to spread. It spreads and spreads, growing wider and wider in every direction, until it becomes the earth as we know it, this great flat island resting on the water. But here's the part that should give you chills. The animals up on the rock arch keep watching, keep waiting for the new earth to be dry enough to stand on. They send down a great buzzard, ancestor of all buzzards, to fly low over the mud and see if it's ready. The buzzard flies across what will become Cherokee country, and the mud is still soft, still wet, still too fragile to hold weight. But the buzzard is tired, its wings ache from the long flight, and as it drops low over the land that would become the Cherokee homeland, its wingtips brush the soft earth. Where its wings dip down, they scoop out valleys. Where its wings lift back up, they push up mountains. That, according to what the elders told Mooney, is why the country of the Cherokee, that rugged tangle of ridges and hollows we now call the Great Smoky Mountains, is folded the way it is. It was shaped by an exhausted bird, flying low in the earliest morning of the world, before the mud had even finished hardening into solid ground. Only after the earth had dried enough did the animals come down from the rock arch above, and even then it was still dark because there was no sun yet. The animals kept bumping into each other in the blackness, kept complaining they couldn't see food, couldn't see danger, couldn't see anything at all. So the animals in council decided they needed light, and someone remembered that on the other side of the sky arch there lived beings who already had a sun. So the animals sent for it, and the sun was placed on a track that ran daily from east to west, directly overhead, right at the height of a person's head, which sounds convenient until you realize what happened next. It was far too hot. The red crawfish had its shell scorched red by that first sun's heat, so hot it burned the meat inside the shell, which is why the story says, the meat of a crawfish is unfit to eat even now, spoiled from that very first blistering day. So the animals in council raised the sun's path higher, and it was still too hot, so they raised it again, and again, 7 times in total, hand's breadth by hand's breadth, until finally the sun sat at just the right height, high overhead, and the world below could bear its warmth without burning. This is why, the story explains, there is a height exactly 7 hands' breadths up where the priests of the old formulas would say the sun rests, a sacred number, 7, that echoes through nearly every part of Cherokee ceremonial life, the 7 directions, 7 clans, 7 sacred formulas for treating the 7 categories of disease. Do you see what's happening here? Every physical feature of the world around the Cherokee people, every mountain, every crooked river, every animal's marking, every plant's power has an origin story woven into it. Nothing in the forest is random. Nothing is empty of meaning. When Swimmer walked James Mooney through these stories, he wasn't just handing over folklore for a book. He was handing over an entire way of seeing, a way of understanding a mountain not as inert rock, but as the wingprint of a tired bird at the dawn of time. Let's go deeper into that forest now, because the animals who shaped it were about to make a decision that would haunt every human being who ever picked up a bow or an axe. According to the story Swimmer shared in the very beginning, animals, plants, and people all lived together peacefully, and there was a kind of equality among them. But that peace didn't last. As the animals tell it, humans multiplied fast, very fast, too fast. People began spreading across the land, and as their numbers grew, they needed more to eat, more to wear, more space to build their homes. They started killing animals not just for food but carelessly, crushing small creatures underfoot without a thought, clearing land without asking permission of anyone. Some animals, the story says, were killed simply for the pleasure of their fur or feathers, tossed aside once taken, treated as if they didn't matter at all. The animals held a council to decide what to do about this. Picture it, every species with its own representative, gathered together in some clearing lit by firelight, deer and bear and wolf, and every bird under the sky, and each one takes a turn speaking about the wrongs done to them by the growing tide of humans. The bears speak first, according to Mooney's record, complaining bitterly about how their kind had been hunted and killed with the very weapons made from their own bodies, bowstrings cut from their own sinew, and they propose that the bears take up bows themselves, learn to shoot like humans do and fight back. They test the idea. One old bear tries to draw a human bow, but his claws get in the way of the string, and no matter how they try, the physical mismatch is too much. Bears cannot become archers. The plan fails, and in the failing, an old sadness settles in, an acceptance that bears, unlike humans, cannot fight injustice with human tools, no matter how just their grievance. Next comes the deer, and the head of the deer clan is a spirit called Awi Usti, the little deer, small and swift and holy, a being so sacred that he is said to be white, gleaming, almost impossible to hit with any weapon. The deer decide on a different kind of justice. Any hunter who kills a deer, they declare, must first ask pardon of the animal's spirit for taking its life. If the hunter forgets or is careless or fails to show the proper respect, then little deer will run to the body of the fallen deer and ask its spirit whether the hunter prayed the appropriate words. If the answer is no, little deer tracks that hunter down unseen and strikes him with a crippling, twisting pain in his joints, rheumatism, a punishment carried invisibly through the air, following the guilty hunter all the way home. This is why, to this day in traditional practice, a hunter who kills a deer offers a prayer of thanks and apology before ever field dressing the animal, because somewhere out there, little deer is listening for it. Then it's the fish and reptiles' turn, and their punishment for humanity is even more unsettling. They decide that humans who fail to show respect, who mock or mistreat them, will be plagued by nightmares of snakes twining around them in their sleep, images so vivid and horrifying that the person wakes gasping, shaking, unable to explain why their dreams turned so dark. And finally, the smallest creatures speak, the insects, the grubs and moths, and they too devise their own ways of striking back at careless humans, subtle irritations, itching, swelling, small aches meant to remind people, again and again, that they are not the only ones with feelings, needs, and rights in this world. By the time the Animal Council finishes its work, the story says, nearly every disease known to humankind has been created, one by one, as a direct response to human disrespect toward the animal world. It's a staggering idea if you sit with it. According to this Cherokee understanding, sickness itself is not random misfortune. It is relational. It is what happens when the balance between humans and the rest of the living world breaks down. But here's the twist, and it's the part of the story that turns this from a tale of punishment into something far more beautiful. While the animals were busy inventing disease, the plants were listening. Every tree, every shrub, every humble weed at the edge of the forest floor overheard the animals' counsel, and the plants decided they didn't want to see humanity destroyed. They felt sympathy for these struggling, fumbling, imperfect creatures. So the plants held their own council, and one by one, each type of plant volunteered to become the cure for one of the diseases the animals had just invented. The oak offered itself for one ailment. The ginseng, a root the Cherokee called by a name meaning mountain man, or sometimes described almost as a small person hidden in the soil, offered itself for another. Even the humblest patch of moss or bark or root, plants that most people would walk straight past without a glance, agreed to hold within themselves the power to heal a specific wound the animals had decided to inflict. This is why in traditional Cherokee medicine, a healer doesn't simply grab any plant and grind it up. Each plant carries this ancient agreement in its very existence. It was assigned to heal this thing, and this thing only, and a medicine man must know exactly which plant answers which affliction, must gather it with the right prayers, at the right time in the right way, because the plant is not just a chemical compound doing chemical things. It is a party to a covenant struck at the dawn of the world between compassion and consequence. Stop and think about what this means for how you'd walk through an old Cherokee forest if you understood this story the way Swimmer understood it. Every leaf underfoot is not just vegetation, it's potentially a promise. Every animal path through the underbrush is not just a route for wildlife. It's a boundary marked out by beings who once held counsel and decided together how much they would tolerate from the newcomers walking upright on two legs. The forest, in this telling, is not a place humans dominate. It's a place humans are permitted to exist within, on terms that were negotiated long before any human was born to hear them. Now, let's talk about how that first human family actually came to be, because it involves one of the strangest, most haunting stories in the entire collection Mooney recorded, the story of Kanati and Selu. In the old time there lived a man named Kanati, whose name means something like the lucky hunter, and his wife Selu, whose name means corn. They lived together, just the two of them and their young son. In a home near a river, every single day Kanati would go out hunting and return with fresh meat, seemingly without effort, as if game simply walked up and offered itself to him. Every single day Selu would go to a small storehouse and return with baskets of corn and beans, again and again, though the boy, curious as boys are, had noticed something strange. His mother never seemed to plant anything. There was no garden, and yet the storehouse never ran empty. One day the boy is playing by the river, and he discovers something remarkable. He finds another boy living in the water, a wild, untamed double of himself, born, the story explains, from the blood of the game animals that Kanati cleaned in the river after each hunt, blood that pooled in the water and somehow, mysteriously, took shape and grew into a second son. This waterborn boy becomes known as the Wild Boy, and he is mischievous, powerful, and dangerously curious, full of questions his tame, domesticated brother had never thought to ask. Two boys become inseparable, and the Wild Boy convinces his more cautious brother to spy on their parents. What are Kanati and Selu really doing when they walk off alone each day? And how is it that meat and corn appear so effortlessly, as if by magic? The boys follow Kanati one day and discover an enormous hidden cave, sealed by a stone, and when Kanati rolls the stone aside, deer and other game animals come pouring out from within, an inexhaustible source hidden inside the mountain itself. Kanati only ever lets out exactly as many animals as his family needs, and then reseals the cave, careful, disciplined, sustainable. But the boys, once they've seen this secret, cannot resist. Later, without their father, they sneak to the cave, roll the stone away themselves, and this time they do not stop the flow. Animal after animal bursts free, deer, turkey, and every other kind of game the boys had ever seen, pouring out of the mountain in a stampede that the boys, with all their mischief and courage, cannot contain or turn back. Kanati arrives just in time to see the animals scattering in every direction, fleeing out into the wide world, no longer confined to that single hidden cave where they could be carefully managed. From that day forward, the story explains, game animals have been scattered across the forests, hard to find, hard to catch, requiring skill and patience and long hunts, because two curious boys once let loose what should have stayed contained. If that were the only mistake the boys made, the story might end there. But the same restless curiosity that led them to the cave of animals also leads them to spy on their mother, Selu, and what they discover about her is even stranger and in its own way more devastating. They watch her go to the storehouse, and there alone she rubs her own body, and from her skin, corn kernels and beans fall away into the baskets, her very body producing the food that has fed the family all this time. The boys, horrified rather than amazed, decide their mother must be some kind of witch, some unnatural creature, and they resolve to kill her. Selu, the story says, somehow already knows what is coming, perhaps sensing it the way a mother in these old stories so often does. She does not run. She does not fight. Instead, she gives her sons careful, precise instructions before they carry out the act. She tells them that after they kill her, they must clear a large circle of ground, drag her body around that cleared circle 7 times, dragging it until her blood soaks into the earth, and then stay awake all night keeping watch over the ground. If they do this properly, she tells them, corn will grow abundantly there by morning, food enough for the family forever. The boys kill their mother, but being boys, careless and impatient the way boys in these old cautionary tales so often are, they don't follow her instructions exactly. Instead of clearing a large circle and dragging her body around it 7 full times, they only clear a few small patches of ground and drag her body across them briefly, cutting corners on the sacred instructions their dying mother had given them. The next morning, corn does grow up from the earth where her blood touched it, but only in a few scattered places, not across the wide, abundant fields her full instructions would have produced. This, the story explains, is why corn must now be planted and tended with labor, weeded, watered, cared for through a whole growing season, rather than simply springing up everywhere on its own the way it would have if the boys had honored their mother's final wishes completely. Sit with that story for a moment, because it is doing an enormous amount of work underneath its surface. It is an origin story for corn agriculture, yes, explaining why farming corn requires so much careful, patient labor rather than being an endless, effortless gift. But it is also something darker and more profound, a story about generational rupture, about children who cannot see the sacrifice their parent is quietly making for them every single day, about curiosity that, left unchecked by patience and respect, destroys the very source of abundance it was trying to understand. Selu gives her body, gives her life, gives explicit instructions for how her death can still nourish her children if only they do it right, and the boys, in their haste and fear, botch even that. It's one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire collection, and it sat, largely unknown outside Cherokee communities, until Swimmer and the others trusted an outsider enough to write it down. After this, Kanati leaves his sons, disappointed in what they have done, and travels off to join Selu, wherever it is the dead in these old stories go, leaving the two boys to grow into the founders of new clans, new lines of humanity descending from that first troubled, magical, and grieving family. And in some versions of the story, before he goes, Kanati and Selu leave behind 7 grains of corn and 7 ears, with instructions on the proper way to plant, sing to, and cultivate the crop, a final gift of knowledge passed down even in the wake of everything that had gone wrong. Now let's step back out from that intimate family tragedy and return to the wider forest, because there is still so much of this world to explore, and one of its most spectacular and dangerous residents is waiting for us. Deep within the mountain lakes and river gorges, the old stories say, there lives a creature so terrifying that even to describe it carelessly is considered dangerous. Its name is Uktena, and Mooney recorded detailed descriptions of it from multiple sources, because the Cherokee took this creature very seriously indeed. Picture a snake as thick around as a tree trunk, with a body large enough to fill a valley, covered in scales that shimmer, and running down its back are rings of alternating colors that seem to shift and blaze like fire when the light catches them wrong. On its head between its horns sits a brilliant, blazing crest, a crystal called the Ulansuti, said to shine with a light so intense it can be seen from a great distance, glowing through darkness, glowing through water, glowing even through solid rock. The Uktena's gaze alone, the story warns, can be deadly. To look directly into its eyes is to invite a kind of curse that spreads through your family, bringing death and misfortune down through the generations. It lives, according to different tellings, in deep pools in mountain passes, or in certain sacred caves, guarding its territory with a menace that few living things dare to challenge. Where did such a creature come from? The stories vary, but one powerful version explains that a group of ancient priests once needed a monster of tremendous power in order to defeat an even greater threat, a giant, devouring frog-like creature or some other primeval terror threatening the world, and so they transformed a common snake, through ceremony and sacrifice, into the first Uktena, a weapon summoned to fight a war between titanic forces at the dawn of time. But summoning that kind of power came with a cost. Once the original threat was defeated, the Uktena itself became a new danger, too strong, too proud, too resentful to simply fade back into the ordinary world. And so it retreated into the wildest, most remote corners of Cherokee country, into the depths of specific named lakes and river bends, where it waits, coiled, ancient, guarding that glittering crystal on its brow. That crystal, the Ulansuti, is where the real danger and the real temptation of this story lives. According to the old formulas Swimmer preserved, if a person of tremendous courage and precise ceremonial knowledge could somehow obtain that crystal from a slain Uktena, it would become the single most powerful divination tool imaginable, able to reveal hidden knowledge, to locate lost things, to foresee the future, to bring its owner tremendous influence and power. But obtaining it required first killing the Uktena, an act so dangerous that Mooney recorded specific instructions describing how a hunter might attempt it. The instructions described digging a trench, shooting an arrow at the one vulnerable spot on the creature's body, a small mark near its 7th stripe, and then, crucially, fleeing immediately, because the poison from the dying Uktena would flow out and could kill everything in its path for a great distance, contaminating water, land, anything downstream of that final furious death throw. Only after enough time has passed to let that poison disperse could a hunter dare to return and retrieve the still glowing crystal from the monster's ruined head. Even having the crystal was not the end of the danger. The old stories warn that the Ulansuti had to be fed, ritually, with the blood of small game, kept wrapped and hidden, brought out only under strict ceremonial conditions, and even then it could be temperamental, dangerous to handle carelessly, capable of bringing disaster on a family that failed to respect its power. A few families in Cherokee memory were said to have actually possessed such crystals, passed down for generations, used sparingly and only by those trained to handle their power, kept as one of the most closely guarded kinds of sacred property a family could own. Think about what this story is really describing. It's a myth about the seduction of forbidden power, about how the greatest treasures often come wrapped in the greatest dangers, guarded by threats that test whether you deserve to hold them at all. It's also, in a very real sense, a story about the mountains themselves, about certain deep, dark, cold mountain pools that local Cherokee families avoided for generations, passed down through oral warning rather than any fence or sign. Don't swim there, don't fish there. Something lives in that water that you do not want to meet. Whether or not you believe in a literal giant serpent with a glowing crystal on its head, the practical effect of this story was to keep people cautious, respectful, and careful around specific dangerous locations in a landscape full of steep drop-offs, sudden floods, and treacherous currents. The myth did real work in the real world, and that is something worth sitting with. Now let's turn from monsters in the depths to something entirely different, and in some ways even stranger, the beings the Cherokee call the Nunnehi. The Nunnehi, whose name means something like the people who live anywhere or the immortals, are described by Mooney's sources as a spirit people who exist alongside the Cherokee, usually invisible, usually unheard, but occasionally, under the right circumstances, glimpsed or even directly encountered. They are said to live inside the mountains themselves, in specific known locations, some of them named mountain peaks and river bends that Cherokee families could point to and identify, places where, if you listened very carefully on a quiet evening, you might hear the faint, distant sound of a drum or a dance going on somewhere beneath the earth, a party you were not invited to but were sometimes allowed to briefly glimpse. The Nunnehi are generally described as benevolent toward the Cherokee, protective even, and Mooney recorded multiple stories of the Nunnehi intervening to help the Cherokee people in moments of crisis. In one striking account tied to real historical memory, the Nunnehi are said to have helped defend Cherokee towns against enemy attacks, appearing as reinforcements exactly when they were needed, fighting alongside the Cherokee and then vanishing, melting back into the mountains once the danger had passed, leaving the defenders to wonder exactly who their mysterious allies had been. There's also a deeply poignant thread running through the Nunnehi stories, connected to the era of forced removal itself. According to some accounts recorded from Cherokee elders, when families were being rounded up and marched away toward what would become the Trail of Tears, certain individuals simply vanished before the soldiers could take them, and it was said quietly, hopefully, that the Nunnehi had taken them in, drawn them into the invisible spirit towns hidden inside the mountains, sheltering them from a fate the rest of their community could not escape. Whether you read that story as literal spiritual truth or as a community's way of processing unbearable grief and loss, it carries enormous emotional weight, a belief that somewhere, hidden just behind the visible world, some of the lost were not lost at all, but safe, dancing an endless dance inside a mountain that the soldiers could never find. The Nunnehi are also connected to specific real, physical locations across the Cherokee homeland, mountains with names that still exist on modern maps, giving these stories a kind of geographic permanence. To walk certain trails in the Smokies, according to this tradition, is to walk past doorways, hidden, sealed, invisible to most eyes, leading into towns of the eternal people who have lived there since before the Cherokee themselves arrived, and who will go on living there long after everything else has changed. There is something profoundly comforting in this vision of the forest, if you let yourself sit with it. It suggests that no landscape is ever truly empty, that even in the depths of catastrophe and forced separation, there might exist a layer of reality offering shelter, refuge, and a kind of quiet, watchful care that no army, no government policy, no historical tragedy could ever fully reach or destroy. But the Nunnehi are not the only hidden people said to inhabit these mountains. There is another group, smaller, stranger, more mischievous, and in their own way just as important to how the old forest was understood, the Unwitsunsti, the little people. Mooney recorded extensive descriptions of these beings, who are said to stand only about knee-high to a grown human, described as beautifully formed, with long hair reaching almost to the ground, living in rock caves and hollow places deep in the laurel thickets and rhododendron tangles that choke so many of the steep slopes in Cherokee country, places so dense with vegetation that a grown person can barely force their way through. The little people love music and dancing above almost anything else, and it's said that if you're walking alone in the deep woods and you hear the faint, ghostly sound of a drum coming from a direction you cannot quite place, and there is no explanation for it, that is the little people holding one of their own dances, hidden just out of sight. They are generally described as kind toward humans, especially toward lost children, whom they are said to look after, getting them gently back home if they wander too far into the forest and become disoriented, though even this kindness comes with careful boundaries, and they carry a fierce, absolute rule about privacy. If a human being is fortunate enough to stumble upon one of their dances or gatherings, they must never, under any circumstances, tell anyone else about it, not the location, not what they witnessed, nothing. Breaking that silence, the old stories warn, brings misfortune down on the person who talked, a punishment for violating a trust that was never fully theirs to hold in the first place. The little people are also credited with helping hunters from time to time, leaving them fortunate signs, guiding game toward a patient hunter's path, small kindnesses extended quietly and without any expectation of thanks. but cross them, disturb their homes, mock them, or fail to respect their boundaries. And the stories describe a darker side, confusion sent to wander a person deep into the woods until they lose all sense of direction, misfortune following them home, small persistent troubles that seem to trace back to nothing except one careless, disrespectful moment in the wrong patch of forest. What's fascinating, and what Mooney himself seemed to sense as he recorded these accounts, is how seriously many Cherokee people continued to take the little people even into the era when he was doing his fieldwork. These were not simply bedtime stories told to entertain children, the way a modern audience might assume. They were treated by many of his sources as an accurate, functioning description of the actual populated landscape around them, a landscape that included visible neighbors, human neighbors in nearby towns, and invisible neighbors, tucked into the laurel thickets and rock shelters, who had their own lives, their own rules, and their own claim to the mountains that long predated any human arrival at all. Now, from the small and hidden, let's turn to something enormous, and we return to that overlap between myth and real. Tangible mountain geography that runs through so much of this tradition. Deep within what is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, there is a mountain the Cherokee called Tennessee Bald, or in some tellings, a specific gap and set of rock formations associated with a towering, slant-eyed giant named Judiculla, sometimes spelled Tsul Kalu, meaning something like he has them slanting, referring to his eyes. Judiculla is described as an immense hunter, a giant who lives high in the mountains, and who once, in a memorable episode Mooney recorded, took a great leap from one mountain peak all the way down into a valley below, landing with such force that his footprint, complete with 7 toes, was said to be permanently pressed into a large soapstone boulder that people could go and see with their own eyes. That boulder still exists today, covered in ancient carved markings, a genuine archaeological site that predates any written record, and generations of Cherokee families pointed to it as physical, undeniable proof that Judiculla had once stood right there, on that very rock in the ancient past. Judiculla is also woven into a courtship story recorded by Mooney, in which a human woman is said to have been courted by this powerful mountain being, and through their meetings, aspects of proper hunting behavior, respect for game animals, and the correct relationship between humans and the forest's more than human inhabitants were established and passed down. Like so much of this mythology, the story of Judiculla is not simply an adventure tale. It's a teaching tool, encoding rules about respect and reciprocity into a narrative memorable and vivid enough that a listener would actually remember it, generation after generation, long after any written law might have faded from use. There's a broader pattern worth pausing on here, because it runs underneath nearly every single story we've walked through so far. Time and again in this body of myth, physical features of the landscape, a soapstone boulder with a giant's footprint, a specific dangerous river pool, a mountain gap where drumming can sometimes be heard, become anchors for moral and spiritual teaching. The forest is not simply described in these stories. It's used as an actual physical memory device, a place where a community's most important values, respect for animals, humility before nature's power, the danger of unchecked curiosity, care for lost children, could be encoded directly into the land itself and carried forward indefinitely, as long as people kept walking those same mountain paths and telling those same stories to their children. When you understand that pattern, you start to realize why it mattered so enormously that Mooney managed to get these stories written down when he did. Because a story that lives only in a specific landscape, tied to specific mountains, specific rivers, specific rock formations, is desperately vulnerable to any disruption of the community's ongoing physical relationship with that landscape. And by the 1880s, the disruption had already been massive and brutal. Most of the Cherokee Nation had been forcibly removed 1,000 miles away from the very mountains these stories were anchored to. Logging and settlement were steadily encroaching on the lands where the eastern band remained. The children growing up on the Qualla boundary in Mooney's time were living through enormous cultural pressure to abandon traditional practices, to attend government-run boarding schools designed explicitly to strip native children of their languages and beliefs, to assimilate into a mainstream American culture that had little patience or respect for what it dismissed as primitive superstition. Against that backdrop, you can start to feel the true weight of what Swimmer and the other Cherokee elders were doing when they sat down with James Mooney and began, carefully, deliberately, to speak these old stories aloud for a stranger's notebook. They were not simply satisfying an academic's curiosity. They were performing an act of cultural preservation under enormous historical pressure, gambling that the risk of sharing sacred knowledge with an outsider was worth taking if it meant that knowledge might survive at all, in some form, for future generations who might otherwise never hear it. In many cases, they were right to worry. Some formulas and stories that Mooney recorded exist today, as far as anyone can determine, nowhere else, preserved only because one government ethnologist happened to earn the trust of exactly the right people at exactly the right precarious moment in history. Let's walk a bit further into the practical, everyday texture of how this belief system shaped Cherokee life, because it wasn't confined to dramatic myths about giant serpents and mountain-leaping giants. It touched the smallest, most ordinary daily actions too. Take fire, for instance. Mooney recorded a vivid origin story explaining how fire first came into the possession of living beings. In the beginning, the story says, there was no fire anywhere in the world, until lightning struck a hollow sycamore tree growing on an island, and fire began burning inside that tree. The animals could see the smoke rising from across the water, but none of them could figure out how to reach it and bring some of that fire back to share with everyone else. One by one, the animals attempt the crossing. The raven flies over first, confident in his size and strength, but he flies too close, and the heat scorches all his feathers black, the exact reason the story explains that ravens are black to this very day. Next, a screech owl tries, flying into the hollow tree to look for a way to grab an ember, but the smoke and heat are so intense that it damages his eyes permanently, leaving screech owls with the strange, ringed eye markings they still carry. Another owl tries and suffers a similar fate, its feathers marked white with ash around the eyes forever after. A black snake tries slithering into the tree and gets trapped by smoke, panicking and thrashing its way back out with blackened, scorched scales, which is why black snakes are black to this day, and the story adds, why they move with that same frantic, darting energy even now. Finally, after every larger, stronger, more obvious candidate has failed and been marked forever by the attempt, the smallest and most unassuming creature steps forward, the water spider. She has a remarkable ability the other animals lack. She can spin a fine, waterproof thread into a small bowl-shaped basket called a tusty bowl, which she can carry on her back. She weaves this tiny bowl, sets it on her back, crosses the water, and unlike all the larger creatures who tried to grab an actual burning coal or stick, she simply places one small, glowing coal into her tiny woven bowl and carries it gently back across the water to the waiting animals, delivering fire to the world at last, not through raw strength or size, but through cleverness, patience, and a tool perfectly suited to a delicate task. Notice what this story quietly teaches, without ever stating it outright as a lesson. The biggest, boldest, most physically powerful animals all fail, and fail badly, marked with lasting scars for their overconfidence. It's the smallest, most easily overlooked creature who succeeds, not through force, but through ingenuity and the right tool for the right job. That is not an accident of storytelling. It's a value being transmitted, generation after generation, to every child who ever heard this story around a fire that, in a sense, this very story explained the existence of in the first place. This pattern, small and clever triumphing over large and reckless, echoes throughout the Cherokee animal stories Mooney recorded, and many of them feature trickster figure who appears again and again across the collection, the rabbit. The Cherokee rabbit stories are full of humor, mischief, and sly cleverness, tales of the rabbit outwitting larger, stronger animals like the wolf, the fox, and even, in some stories, humans themselves, through nothing but quick thinking and nerve. These stories, told and retold, clearly delighted their listeners across generations, offering laughter and entertainment even while carrying, underneath the comedy, the same consistent message about cleverness outperforming brute strength that runs through so much of Cherokee storytelling more broadly. Let's turn now to something that connects almost everything we've discussed so far, weaving it together into a single unified worldview, and that is the concept of the sacred number 7, and its close companion, the number 4, both of which appear so consistently throughout this mythology that they function almost like a hidden architecture, holding the entire belief system together. Remember the earth resting on water, hanging from the sky by 4 cords, one at each direction. Remember the sun's path being raised 7 times before reaching its proper height. Remember the 7 sacred formulas addressing 7 categories of disease, 7 original clans in traditional Cherokee social structure, the 7 stripes marking the vulnerable spot on the terrifying Uktena's body. These numbers were not decorative flourishes added for storytelling flair. They reflected an entire cosmological structure, a belief that the world itself was organized around these particular numbers, 4 representing the cardinal directions and the fundamental balance of the physical world, 7 representing a kind of completeness or perfection that touched everything from medicine to ceremony to the architecture of the sacred fire itself, which was traditionally built and tended according to precise ritual specifications passed down for uncounted generations. The sacred fire deserves its own moment of attention here, because it sits at the very heart of traditional Cherokee spiritual life, and it connects directly back to that first fire brought across the water by the small, patient water spider. In each traditional Cherokee town, a communal fire was kept burning, tended by designated keepers, treated not as a simple practical necessity for warmth and cooking, but as a living, sacred entity in its own right, connected to the sun itself, connected to the very first fire kindled by lightning in that hollow sycamore tree at the beginning of the world. Ceremonies, decisions, and important communal gatherings were often held in relation to this fire, and its careful, continuous tending represented a community's ongoing relationship with forces far older and larger than any single human lifetime. This is, in many ways, the deepest truth sitting underneath everything Mooney recorded in the Cherokee Old Forest mythology. It is a worldview built entirely around relationship and reciprocity, rather than domination and extraction. Humans do not simply take from the forest in this belief system. They negotiate with it. They owe it apologies when they take a life for food. They owe it patience when they wish to grow their crops. They owe it respect when they walk through its most sacred and dangerous places. And in turn, the forest, through its animals, its plants, its hidden peoples, and its ancient spirits, offers something back: food, medicine, protection, and occasionally, in moments of the deepest crisis, even shelter and salvation for those who might otherwise have been entirely lost. It's worth pausing here to think about why these stories still matter so much today, more than a century after Mooney first wrote them down, and long after the world they describe has been so dramatically changed by roads, by farms, by cities, by the steady advance of an entirely different way of relating to land. Part of the answer is simply historical and scientific. Mooney's collection remains an irreplaceable record, cited by anthropologists, linguists, and Cherokee cultural historians ever since its publication, precisely because it captured living oral tradition directly from tradition keepers at a moment when so much else about Cherokee life was under existential pressure. Without Swimmer's trust, without the courage of the other elders and sources who spoke to Mooney, an enormous amount of this specific, detailed knowledge might have simply vanished, taken silently into the grave by the last people who remembered it in full. But there is a deeper answer too, one that reaches beyond pure historical preservation. These stories offer a genuinely different way of imagining the relationship between people and the natural world, one built on humility rather than mastery, on negotiation rather than ownership, on the assumption that the forest is populated by beings with their own perspectives, their own grievances, their own capacity for both kindness and punishment, rather than simply being a passive resource waiting to be used up. In a modern era increasingly grappling with the consequences of centuries of treating forests, rivers, and mountains as nothing more than raw material for extraction, there is something quietly urgent about a mythology that insists, again and again in story after story, that every act of taking carries an obligation, that every animal killed deserves an apology, that every mountain hides something that deserves to be left undisturbed. Today, the eastern band of Cherokee Indians continues to live on and around the Qualla boundary in western North Carolina, and many of the places named in these old stories remain visible on the landscape, mountains, rivers, and rock formations that visitors to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park pass by every single day, most of them with no idea of the layers of story folded into the ground beneath their feet. Some traditional knowledge keepers and cultural programs within the Eastern Band continue to teach and preserve these stories, alongside the Cherokee language itself, working to ensure that what Swimmer and the others entrusted to Mooney over a century ago does not become merely an artifact in an old book, but remains a living tradition, carried forward by people who still call these mountains home. As we come to the end of this journey together, think back to where we began, that image of a young outsider arriving in the fog-wrapped hills of the Qualla boundary in the 1880s, carrying nothing more than paper, pencil, and a genuine desire to listen. Think about the old man named Swimmer, weighing in his own mind the risks and the responsibilities of speaking sacred formulas out loud to a stranger, deciding in the end that the story surviving mattered more than the story staying hidden. Think about the countless generations before him who had carried these same stories, unwritten, purely by memory, through droughts and wars and forced removals, and every other catastrophe history had thrown at them, refusing to let the thread break. Because of that unbroken chain of memory, and because of one government ethnologist who happened to earn the trust he needed at exactly the right moment, we can still, all these years later, walk into that old forest together. We can still hear about the tired buzzard whose wingtips carved the Smoky Mountains into being. We can still feel the weight of Selu's final instructions to her careless sons, and the quiet tragedy of corn that must now be grown through labor rather than received as an effortless gift. We can still shiver, just slightly, at the thought of a massive, glowing-crested serpent coiled in the black water of some remote mountain pool, waiting. We can still imagine, on some especially quiet evening deep in the rhododendron thickets, the faint, ghostly sound of a drum, coming from a direction we cannot quite place, and wonder just for a moment whether we are being watched by someone small, ancient, and entirely uninterested in being seen. That is what the Cherokee told James Mooney about the old forest. Not simply a collection of quaint stories about how the world came to be. A complete, intricate, deeply moral vision of what it means to live inside a world that is alive in every direction you look, populated by neighbors who remember every debt, every kindness, and every broken promise, stretching back to a time before the sun had even found its proper place in the sky. The trees are still standing. The mountains still hold the shape of that ancient bird's tired wings. And somewhere, if the old stories are even a little bit true, the drumming has never really stopped.